Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, The Looming Election and the Politics of Trade. This webinar is the August event of the State of Trade webinar series, a monthly series of experts offering timely insights into the rapidly changing world of international trade. Before we begin, let's cover a few housekeeping items. On your screen, you can see multiple application widgets that you can use. You will see that a copy of today's slide deck is available in the additional materials section on the bottom left. We invite you to join us for upcoming webinars. You can find links for the August and September webinars on the top right. So next week we will have top global trends in ocean freight. And then we will, of course, have our September State of Trade coming up in about a month. We invite you to ask questions through the Q&A widget on the right. We will try to answer as many as we can during the webinar, mostly at the end. And we invite you to share with us any other webinar topics you'd like us to explore or any comments you might have about the program. Our goal here is to share valuable insights, and so you can find a quick survey on the bottom right. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner. And then last technical note like this, an on-demand version of the webinar will be available shortly after the webinar and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. And now the part that makes the lawyers happy, please do keep in mind that all information provided in this webinar is presented based on the situation at the time and may not be customized to your specific situation. All right, on with the show. I'm Phil Levy. I'm Chief Economist at Flexport, and I am very fortunate to be joined today by two true experts on both the workings and politics of, and law, as it happens, of trade. So let me introduce them one by one. Scott Linscomb is Senior Fellow in Economic Studies at the Cato Institute, where he writes on international and domestic economic issues, including international trade, subsidies and industrial policy, manufacturing and global supply chains, and economic dynamism. Scott's also a senior visiting lecturer at Duke University Law School, where he's taught a course on international trade law, and he previously taught international trade policy as a visiting lecturer at Duke. Prior to joining Cato, Scott spent 2 decades practicing international trade law at White & Case LLP, where he litigated national and multilateral trade disputes and advised multinational corporations on how to optimize their transactions and business practices consistent with global trade rules and regulations. We are also, Scott, welcome. Glad to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, Phil. Great to be here.
And then we also have Mike Smart. So Mike is a managing director at Rock Creek Global Advisors, where he focuses on international trade and investment policy, including market access and regulatory matters. He's currently advising multinational companies and financial institutions on trade and investment actions, on disputes and negotiations that affect their business operations. He previously served as International Trade Counsel on the Democratic staff of the U.S. Senate Committee on Finance. That's the committee that tends to handle trade matters in the Senate. In that role, he advised then-Chairman Max Baucus of Montana and members of the committee on various trade members, including World Trade Organization negotiations and disputes, free trade agreements, and the trade aspects of climate change legislation. Before joining the Finance Committee, Mike was Director for International Trade and Investment on the staff of the National Security Council at the White House. There he focused on WTO negotiations, trade and financial services, free trade agreements, and bilateral investment treaties. He also served as the lead White House staff for cabinet-level dialogues with Brazil and India. Mike, thanks for being here with us.
Thanks very much, Phil.
All right, so you see we have an all-star cast, and here's what we're going to do with them. We're going to try and cover all the facets of what's going on as we find ourselves right between in the midst of one major party convention with another right around. It's a political season. We want to talk about what politics means for trade and what trade means for politics. So just to give you a preview of where we're going, we'll talk a little bit about what role politics and trade have had with each other in the recent past, move into where do we see the parties right now, and then take on a bunch of the issues that are looming. And some of these are issues around the globe, very particular trading partners or negotiations. And some of these are issues at home where it's, will we pursue industrial policies and will we reorient our domestic policies to match a different attitude towards trade? We will try to close with gazing into our crystal balls. And I don't have one, but I think Scott's and Mike's were much better. And see what would a first Biden administration look like or a second Trump administration look like as far as trade is? So with that, let me lead off by setting the stage a little bit. And I'll try to be a bit provocative and then see if I can get a reaction out of the guys. There's a bit of a conventional wisdom, which is that trade is not a huge issue in elections. You say it to appeal to certain groups, but it doesn't matter that much to them. And so it's something that every 4 years you make a few proclamations and then you go on about your business and do what you want. I'm going to try to present a few pieces of evidence that suggest that at least in recent cycles, it hasn't quite been that innocuous. So item one that I'll put forward, there's a fascinating book by Jonathan Allen called Shattered, Inside Hillary Clinton's Doomed Campaign. And so I quote from that book here. He really gives pride of place, not the only reason, but a major reason for why Joe Biden did not enter the contest for the Democratic nomination in 2015. He puts a lot of that weight on the TPP, where essentially it was in that month of October when everyone was positioning, where there were some doubts about the Hillary Clinton candidacy within the Democratic Party. And it was at that time when she declared her opposition to the TPP, a bit of a controversial stance given that she had had a role in negotiating it and had previously talked about it in glowing terms. But the implication, and I won't read the quotes out for you here, but they're there if you want to see them. The implication was this put Joe Biden, then Vice President Biden, in a very difficult position because he could either be the person in the Democratic race who was embracing the TPP, not a terribly popular position, or he would have to be breaking with President Obama, which would also have been problematic. And the upshot was that as that month proceeded, Joe Biden decided that that wasn't his time. As we know, his time came later, and he got the nomination, or was formally nominated last night. But this was an instance where this was not so innocuous. It did, at least they present some evidence that this helped shape the race. All right, skipping forward from the nominating process to the actual general election, here are some poll results. These are exit polls after the November election when Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton. And what it did was it sorted voters by what was their sense of what international trade does. So they let people decide whether they thought international trade did not affect U.S. jobs, or it created U.S. jobs, or it took away U.S. jobs. And so that's the breakdown that you see. For the 11% of the exiting voters who said that trade doesn't really affect U.S. jobs, they went essentially 2-1, better than 2-1 for Hillary Clinton in the election. For those who thought that trade created U.S. jobs, that was 39%. So you got about 50% of the public. She was just shy of 60%, and then about 35% of them went for President Trump. For the 42% who thought that trade took away U.S. jobs, you saw that that really did differentiate them. 64% of them supported President Trump, and only 32% supported Hillary Clinton. So this looks like the kind of issue that really did separate a bit. My last piece of evidence, and then I'm going to open this up for comment, is that subsequently we had the last presidential election in 2016. We had a midterm election in 2018, by which point we already had launched into something of a trade war with China, familiar to everyone who's a regular listener of this webinar, and those who aren't. But it was just getting rolling then. We'll talk about that, about the actual trade war and China relations in more detail later. There was a study by Emily Blanchard, Chad Bown, and Davin Chor where they looked by congressional district to try to see, did the tariffs have an effect? That was this something that actually influenced the way people voted? And they tried to, as economic studies are wont to do, throw in a bunch of other control variables. So it wasn't just a yes or no. It was, can you separate this out and identify it as a driver? And they did, in fact, find that greater local exposure to the consequences of the trade war meant a decline in support and loss of seats for Republican candidates. And so it ended up being roughly on the par with healthcare, was their finding, and accounted for about a quarter of the decline in Republican support in these key counties. All right, Scott, I know you were a bit skeptical of all this about trade as a real driver. Are you persuaded now that you've heard me for 5 minutes?
I am not, actually. No, I think these actually, everything you've presented, I think is quite consistent with at least my view on trade and trade politics. As I wrote in my paper in 2018, which has actually been linked on the webinar site here. And I think all of this shows really two or three phenomena. And first is that there is certainly an intense but small share of the electorate that does care about trade. And typically, at least pre-2018, that leaned more protectionist. And so you've seen, and this goes way back before 2016 for sure, candidates tend to parrot protectionist rhetoric and make protectionist promises in order to cater to that small but intense minority. And because they know that most people don't care and don't vote on the issue, they think they can get away with it. And so I think that, that when you looked at what Hillary Clinton did in 2016, I think that's a really classic case of that. TPP was important for a small and intense group, some of which on trade and protectionist grounds, others on broader anti-corporate, anti-elite sentiment, whatever it is. And she made a quite calculating, strategic decision. I think it was a bad one, but never mind, that she wanted to cater to that intense minority. Now, on the exit polling, that gets to the second phenomenon, which is trade views. If you look at the polling data over time, tend to be a top-down rather than bottom-up issue for the majority of the electorate. And so this is, again, getting into those people who don't really care, who don't pay close attention. Well, what that means is they accept and parrot signals from their political leadership. And you actually see over time as Trump rose to power in 2015 and 2016, you saw Republicans who used to be pro-trade suddenly become anti-trade. And you saw Democrats in the last few years who used to be anti-trade are now suddenly very pro-trade. I would argue that much of this movement, much of these opinions reflects not some strongly held, informed view on trade policy, but instead signaling from political leadership. And then last, and somewhat related to the first, you showed the poll on China trade in the 2018 election. Well, this is much more, I think, an economic issue in terms of people voting their pocketbooks than it is really a trade issue. But to the extent that it is one, it goes back again to this idea of there being a small and intense minority that is affected or has at least strong beliefs about trade and import competition and exports and the rest, and thus can vote on that issue. But I don't think that's even in the Bown and Blanchard analysis, they're not finding this as a nationwide trend. They're finding this in very discrete, in specific congressional districts. So really I think it fits quite well with what I wrote in 2018.
Okay. That's great. Mike, what's your take? Are you persuaded that trade actually mattered in all this?
Yeah, I am. I mean, I think it is an issue that politicians have been able to use quite effectively to their advantage. And I think you and Scott have both hit on the key issues, which is one, geography matters. I mean, in addition to the study you mentioned, David Autor and some of his colleagues came up with a study that showed that Trump's positioning and campaign rhetoric on trade in 2016 paid dividends in the industrial Midwest across, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, areas that have been most sensitive to import competition, particularly from China. So you say, does trade matter? Well, yes, and it depends a lot on geography, right? The other thing I would say is that politicians have been able to use trade, very specific issues within trade policy, to rally important stakeholders. I mean, certainly that's been the case with unions who exercise a lot of influence on the Democratic side, both in kind of mobilization and in fundraising, but also a lot of folks in the NGO community who have seized on particular labor or environmental issues, or this issue of, the use of investor-state dispute settlement, sort of investment rules where companies can enforce their rights, using this to raise concerns about trade policy has been very effective in terms of kind of stakeholder mobilization, which, that's the kind of thing that determine election outcomes. So, Phil, bottom line, I'm in agreement with you. This is an issue that will be in our political debate and is influential on the outcomes.
All right, Scott, you lose 2-1. No, I'm just kidding. So what we're going to do is now we're going to have something of a vote on this in the sense of we just gave some backwards looking evidence. We're going to talk about where things stand for the current election, but we are going to, now that everybody's all warmed up and you've had a chance to settle into your webinar mindset, we're going to ask everyone to vote, please. Theme of the day. And so in the first question we're asking, we'll have a few of these as we go along, in the November congressional and presidential elections, do you think trade policy issues will play a leading role, will be one important issue among several, will play only a minor role, or will barely be mentioned? We've moved on from all this. So for all of you out in the audience, let me ask you to place your bets, give your best take. You've heard a little primer material on this, and say what you think is going to happen as we move to the next election. And then we'll share our thoughts with you. So, all right. Please place your votes. And we will be tallying things up shortly. I don't know if this is working quite as anticipated, but all right. I'll give a little more time. Please do pick one. Say we'd like to get a decent number of audience members voting, and then we will hopefully, if our elves are doing what they're supposed to be doing, we'll have a tally for you. It's not looking on my end like it normally looks, hence the tone of voice. All right. I've heard from at least one voter that they have voted. Okay, but let's see what we got. Let's see. Are there any results? We will all be surprised. Yes, there are results. All right. Good. That's a relief from my end. Okay, so very few of you think it will play a leading role, just under 6%. The vast majority say this is going to be one important issue among several, with a second place finish going to will play a minor role. All right, thank you for that. We were always curious to know where you all stand. We'll let you come back with some other opinions in a bit. What I want to turn to now, we just talked about where we came from on this. Now I want to sort of get into where are the parties now? And by parties, it's important to keep in mind that some of this is where the presidential candidates, they clearly draw the most attention. But there's also this question of where is the rest of the party? Where is Congress? And does that matter? So I thought just to sort of put a reminder up on the screen as we launch into this discussion, it has been, we talked about the politics and where people voted before. It has been a very eventful time in trade policy under President Trump, that if you look at the actions he's taken, he has been, in the first week in office, it was departing from the TPP. You will hear us mentioning the national security tariffs, which even I'm as bad as the lawyers on this, will sometimes refer to as Section 232, where these come from. These are the tariffs on steel and aluminum. There are some questions there. When I say Congress matters, does it really? Because we've got executive versus legislative power questions. China, NAFTA, now USMCA, EU, Airbus, WTO. Mike, let me let you come in first on this. We have a different lineup than we had before. It used to be that, for a while there, you were able to oppose TPP, oppose NAFTA, and you were good to go. Where do you see the campaigns lining up now?
Yeah. So here's where I think the two campaigns agree. And first and foremost is China, because I think that when you look at kind of the economic, commercial, trade, investment-related challenges posed by the Chinese market, I think there's a tremendous amount of bipartisan agreement. Whether you're talking about industrial subsidies, favoritism of state-owned enterprises, relatively high tariffs, theft of intellectual property rights, the diagnosis of the problem is very, very similar. And so whether you have a second Trump term or a first Biden term after November 3rd, I think that the objectives will remain quite similar. The other area of agreement that I see is kind of in the area of buy local requirements, or what we call in the U.S. Buy American. This is something that Trump ran on in 2016 and has pursued, at least to some degree, during his first term. And in some of Biden's initial statements, you also see a fair amount of sympathy for the idea that, look, whatever we spend on procurement using taxpayer dollars should be spent in the United States. And so I think that's another area where they agree. In terms of disagreement, I see that focusing on kind of the nations other than China. And let me just take Europe as an example. I mean, with Trump, he has certainly gone after the European Union on a number of fronts. I don't think that Biden would do that to the same degree, and that's not how he's talking on the campaign trail. I would also say that Biden would be more inclined to embrace kind of the idea of a multilateral trading system and solving issues at the WTO. And so I think that's an area where they would disagree. One final thing just to note, I think during the course of the campaign, you'll also hear the Biden folks talk about things that we need to do at home, kind of an affirmative offensive agenda to make the United States more competitive globally. Whereas I think on the Trump campaign, you hear more about how we are defending against the unfair practices of other countries. So that's how I'd summarize the differences and areas of agreement.
That's helpful. Scott, what's your take on this? Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to agree with all of that. I'd add a couple points. First, I think on China, totally agree that there's bipartisan support. The question will be how to approach it. And that, I think, gets to the multilateral angle and the whole, working with allies angle. I think that part of the difference will be the Biden administration, I think, would very much look to build a coalition of countries, whether through the WTO or outside of it, that work together on China. And, the Trump administration is far more unilateralist, although they have made some overtures to the EU and Canada on this. But let's face it, it's very difficult to have any sort of agreement there when you're also at the same time hitting your close allies with national security tariffs and so forth. So, but then I think another key point is I think the Democrats are going to try to play footsie with Trump's trade war. And what I mean by that is I think they want to claim that the trade war has failed, and that's what they're doing. But they don't want to take a position on the tariffs in particular and on removing them. And that, I think, will leave it open to the imagination about how they would prosecute these trade conflicts better. And so, you're seeing that somewhat right now, in that there occasionally we supporters of the open trade and free trade get excited because they talk about the tariffs not working. However, they don't really go the next step and say that they would certainly remove them and they would avoid this type of unilateralism. And I wonder if they're going to be able to get away with that through the fall. But right now, that seems to be the approach. I would guess that at some point it's going to come to a head, but we'll see.
Okay, so we're definitely going to come back to Democrats playing footsie. And in fact, Mike, if you can't contain yourself, you're welcome to jump in on that now. But another thing I also wanted to ask you, because Mike, you've spent time both on Capitol Hill and in the executive branch. There's this tendency to sort of talk about sort of the unitary parties and what each of them is doing. Does it matter anymore what other members, other than the president, think about trade? Does Congress still play a role in this?
Oh, that's a great question. To me, one of the I'll say disappointments of the first term of the Trump administration was the degree to which congressional Republicans who previously supported a more open trade and investment regime have really either become quiet and lost their voice, or have actually joined in supporting the president's policies. And so, to me, at this point in time, there is really not a significant congressional counterweight to the administration, and so that gets to the very good point that Scott made, that unfortunately, like too many issues, a position on a policy depends as much on partisan affiliation as on anything, and it would be very interesting whether that continues to be the case if there is a change in administration, because I mean, at this point, I've seen a major shift on the Republican side toward more support for protectionist approaches. On the Democratic side, I think it's still an open question. You have, the contingent that has supported trade, but a relatively small minority of the Democratic caucus. Will that grow under a Biden administration? I think we'll have to remains to be seen.
Well, Scott, your take on I know you've been skeptical of Congress as a check on the president on this too, right?
I have. I think Trump has really done us a favor in the sense of revealing the impotence of the legislative branch on trade, because Congress has delegated so much power to the president over the last 100 years, give or take, and because checking that power often, especially in the case of sections 301 and 232, requires a veto-proof majority. The
301 was the underlying thing for the China fight, right?
Yeah, right. And so, because of that, because you need a veto-proof majority in this hyper-partisan climate, that's essentially impossible. And so, I think the only time Congress got close to doing anything was on the auto tariffs threat under Section 232. But even then, all of the actual reform efforts disappeared in terms of legislation to actually check that power. And then, of course, the courts recently have really said that the president has almost unlimited power under 232 when it comes to imposing national security measures, with very, very limited checks on that power in terms of things simply like, the duration of the tariff or modification of the tariff and that kind of thing. So, I'm not very confident, regardless of who's in charge, that the legislative branch will have much of a say as long as the president acts under existing law and doesn't go to Congress seeking changes to the law, for example, to implement a trade agreement or something like that.
So, Mike, Scott tosses out something here which actually could argue in Congress's favor. If you listen to what some of the leaders in Congress say, people like Chairman Grassley, for example, of the Senate Finance Committee, they will generally make the point it is not a worthwhile exercise to get out and criticize the president in public on these issues. To the extent we're going to have an impact, it's going to be behind closed doors. Scott raised the example of auto tariffs. And so one of the investigations, as you know very well, that took place under national security tariffs was autos, but we have not seen auto tariffs. Is there an argument to be made that there is some kind of congressional check working behind the scenes quietly?
It reminds me of so many conversations that I've had with Republican friends on the Hill who work in leadership or on the trade committees. And Phil, that is precisely the argument that they have made. And they're honest, there is truth to it, of course. And particularly when you're dealing with the president like Trump, who doesn't seem to respond very well to public criticism. But I would say that other than Auto 232, I think you would be hard-pressed to find another example where those internal discussions have yielded an outcome that was more in line with traditional Republican thinking on trade. And I would include all of the issues on the slide here, including the national security tariffs, getting out of TPP, many elements of the new USMCA, which, yes, Republicans voted for by a large margin, but only after setting aside what had been core interests and actually were some of the reasons that they had concerns with the TPP agreement negotiated by President Obama. So, yes, it's a valid argument, but I would say that kind of internal jawboning, we don't see a lot of evidence that it's worked very well.
Yeah, and I just add actually two quick things. One, I think that there's also a quite legitimate argument that that the auto tariffs decision could be framed as simply Trump acting in his own economic interest, in the sense of slapping tariffs on Ford Festivas and Mercedes and BMWs would have been a pretty disastrous move, in terms of direct effect and then retaliation. But the other thing is that, I mentioned where Congress does have a little bit of power is approving things that the president wants. I think we saw a little of that with respect to steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And as part of that, getting the USMCA through, so Grassley, for example, was quite vocal on that. But again, those are very narrow exceptions to the general rule, which is a president getting to do basically whatever he wants.
Yeah. And of course, emphasizing your point on these being narrow exceptions, we've then seen aluminum tariffs come back.
Right. Now that the deal's done.
Now that the deal's done. All right. Before we leave the sort of broad brush stuff, we start jumping into these issues, and the issues are fun. Last question in terms of the broad brush, how we shape this thing. Do you think that to the extent we have a trade debate, and Mike, I'll start with you on this one, to the extent we have a trade debate in this upcoming election, is it going to be a national debate, or is this going to be a battleground debate where it's sort of narrow targeted at, the blue wall states, so-called, or where more in the industrial Midwest?
I think the Trump campaign will make the argument nationally, but I think it's going to resonate the most in the industrial Midwest, just as it did in 2016. Joe Biden actually has a fairly mixed record on trade. He's supported some trade deals, opposed others, and maybe not coincidentally opposed agreements as he was thinking about running for president, maybe back in 2003, 2004. But in any event, from Trump's perspective, Biden supported the three most important agreements. One, NAFTA. Two, PNTR from China, for China when they came into the WTO. And three, TPP, when he was vice president. So I think that you can bet on the Trump campaign using those three issues together with a soft on China message that he hopes will resonate with voters in those states, particularly that have been most impacted by import competition from China.
Scott, you're good with that?
Yeah, I think that's about right. I do think I would just add that the Republicans did try this a bit in 2018, and it wasn't very successful. and the soft on China, and TPP and the rest. And so I do wonder how effective this will be, particularly given that Biden and the Democrats seem all too willing to be very tough on China, and to be economic nationalist in a lot of other ways. It doesn't really strike me that this will be a very effective pitch, but I agree entirely that they're going to try, and it will be more national than simply, in Ohio and Wisconsin.
All right. Good. So we've been sort of nibbling around the edges. There's a couple, I want to sort of take on some of the issues, and we've touched on some of them. The campaigns will naturally pick up, as you guys have mentioned, China, for example, an issue that's sort of prominent and that they think resonates. In fact, what I wanted to do was sort of take this a bit by looking at the whole agenda, what's out there, and where do we think they might come down. This may be some of the same of sort of previewing what they do in office, but part of the premise of the way we've structured this is there can be very sharp differences between where a presidential candidate stands in a campaign and where they are once they get into office. They face different constraints, different priorities. So for the moment, let's look at this from sort of a campaign perspective and see where do these issues, will they be taken up? Will they be avoided? Or what role will they play, if any? We've talked about China sort of in the abstract. There's been an interesting development recently, though, and I want to see what you guys make of this. I wrote a little bit about it, and there should be the link up to some of my pieces. But this is President Trump in January was very proud of the deal that he struck with China. It did not accomplish everything they had set out to accomplish. Therefore, they referred to it as a phase one deal, which left many tariffs in place, but seemed to bring some tranquility to what had been a very volatile trading environment. We've had two developments recently that were fairly interesting. One was that there had been a plan for a phase two that would take up the other issues that was going to come sometime after the election or early next year. President Trump announced roughly a month ago he didn't really have an interest in talking about phase two anymore. And then with phase one, there was supposed to be a review of phase one just this last weekend. And then the president said, I didn't want it. We didn't have it. Scott, what do you make of all this? And how will these agreements play into the campaign?
Well, I think, again, to kind of reiterate what I said earlier, I think the Democrats will try very much to claim that Trump that the China deal is a massive failure, and that China basically pulled one over on Trump. And that he sacrificed all of these important issues, particularly on human rights, and in order to get, some additional soybean sales that didn't even materialize in the first place. And my guess is that will be a very prominent part of their pushback against the idea that Trump is strong on China and Biden is weak. However, the less said, but equally important will be all of those tariffs. And in my view, as I just wrote, yesterday for the Dispatch, I don't see those tariffs going away. And so, and I'm not quite sure if the phase one deal itself goes away. Because that is more complicated in terms of the politics, which, as we've already said repeatedly, the bipartisan intensity against China is as strong as I've ever seen it. And so I think it would be very difficult for Biden to offer anything on that, particularly during the campaign, but maybe even going into a Biden administration.
Mike, what's your take? And I'm also going to invite you, while we're touching on China, Scott, you can come back to this if you like. Yeah. Are these other business investment issues, things like Huawei, the prominent stuff on TikTok and WeChat, are these a substitute? Is this a, don't watch what the left hand's doing, look over here at the right?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's a substitute. I actually see it as an extension of kind of the administration's China policy. I mean, we began with the trade war, which has been kind of put on hold by the phase one deal, not rolled back, as Scott said. And although Trump is making threatening noises about walking away from the deal, it makes little sense from his perspective to do so, given that all the obligations in that agreement, maybe they're not enough, I don't think they are, but all of the obligations run to China and not to the United States. So it really doesn't make much sense to withdraw. But certainly from a business perspective, the actions taken against various Chinese companies, most recently TikTok and Tencent, which is the company that owns WeChat, as well as Huawei, that really has the possibility of being commercially more significant. Again, an area where there is a fair amount of agreement between Democrats and Republicans that the data held by some of these companies is vulnerable to use by the Chinese government. This is one, I think, where you have a coincidence of something that feeds into the president's political message and also addresses a concern among some of the national security types and the more hawkish members of his administration.
So we have sort of a consensus here that China is definitely going to play an issue in the campaign, and it's going to be an effort by both sides to sort of show that they're tougher on China. Let me move us a little bit to North America. I'm not really skipping the national security tariffs because they come into play with aluminum. There was an effort here to sort of put this to bed, as it were. It was the president concluded the USMCA deal. There was a revision with a lot of Democratic requests being incorporated, but this was then signed and passed. It seemed like that might all now be quiet. And then we've had some rumblings. There's been the aluminum stuff with Canada. There's some other disputes with Mexico. Talk about, is the labor issues being properly taken care of? Scott, are we going to hear anything in the campaign about North America?
I think perhaps a bit, particularly given the new tariffs back on Canadian aluminum, because I think that, again, a core element of the Biden campaign's trade pitch is that the Trump administration has some valid claims with respect to China, some valid claims with respect to the WTO and so forth, and manufacturing decline and the rest. But they have horribly botched the execution by attacking some of our closest allies, and of course Canada being prominently featured in that regard. So I would not be surprised at all to hear Canada come up in that respect, in the sense that, this is not only economically painful, particularly for a lot of companies and farmers are, in the Midwest who have their supply chains and so forth linked to Canada and now are will be hit by Canadian retaliation. But also in kind of the broader context of reneging on a deal made as part of the USMCA with, again, one of our close allies. And this being, a quintessential example of Trump being just simply bad at the geopolitical game. And so, yeah, I think it will remain. I think it will be at least one of many features.
Mike, I was a little surprised when the Democrats did offer some support for the USMCA. Yes, they got a renegotiation, but the NAFTA had been held responsible for an awful lot of ills, and it wasn't entirely clear how the USMCA was going to fix those ills. Are Democrats really going to set aside these North American concerns, or are they going to just metamorphosize into something else?
Well, I think where the debate will go is on implementation and enforcement of USMCA. And whether it is a Trump administration or a Biden administration, I think the Democrats as a group will be pushing very hard to use these new enforcement mechanisms to address what concerns they see, particularly in Mexico regarding labor, but in some of the other areas as well. I mean, look, at some point they had to take yes for an answer. I mean, the Democrats got everything that they asked for, essentially, in this agreement. In terms of, a very intrusive labor inspection mechanism, that says not only will we look at what the national government is doing in terms of maintaining laws and regulations consistent with the labor chapter, but we'll reserve the ability to go in and do inspections at the plant level to ensure compliance with those same laws and regulations. Something I think that Democrats never dreamed they would be able to get in a trade agreement. So when that is what is on offer, I think they, again, had to take yes for an answer. What I think will be interesting is to see whether if in the future a Biden administration were to negotiate a similar agreement, would Republicans support it in the numbers that they did before? I mean, I maintain you would have had a relatively small handful of Republican votes for this agreement if it had been negotiated by a Democratic president. It crossed so many Republican red lines, whether it was on, a very onerous rule of origin for the auto sector that included a minimum wage requirement, or the elimination of any remedies for investors, which is now becoming quite an issue in Mexico, where you've got a very nationalist leader who's endangering a number of U.S. investments. So, politics of this were just scrambled, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in the months ahead.
Scott, you touched on this a little bit in your piece for the Dispatch, and what I thought was a very interesting question, hard to resolve. We've traditionally had new trade agreements set a precedent, and you work from there on the future ones. Mm-hmm. Given what Mike was saying, what is your take on this? Is USMCA a template now?
Well, if it is, I think it's going to be quite difficult to conclude new trade agreements, and at least with developing countries, just simply because, as Mike mentioned, the labor and environmental rules are extremely onerous, and the rules of origin are extremely onerous. And it worked in the USMCA simply because, or at least in large part because of NAFTA already existed, because the commercial relationships already had been made. It was the supply chains had already evolved, and so there was a bit of a gun to the head of the NAFTA that allowed for some of that to happen. And we've seen the Trump administration do this with respect to the U.S.-Korea FTA as well, right? They can extract concessions because the agreement already exists. Now, will it be possible to actually forge a new agreement with those same rules? And I just don't know. I do think Mike's 100% right that, look, the Democrats got an amazing deal. They essentially got whatever they wanted, and will certainly be pushing that in the future. I just don't know who is going to be a receptive party on the other side of the table.
Okay, so I knew we were going to have this. We got lots of interesting things to cover. I want to touch one last thing on this slide on the agenda. Most of the thing about issues that might thrust themselves to the front, the events, dear boy kind of thing. And that's Europe. So, Mike, you listed Europe as one of the sort of potential points of disagreement. I was a little bit you would have thought that they would try to make things quiet, and I interpreted the U.S. trade rep's recent Airbus announcement as trying to keep things quiet, that they weren't pushing that debate further at the moment. We've got Airbus out there as potential application of more tariffs and escalation. We've also got this issue of Brexit looming, which that comes up in two ways. One, there's just a clock ticking where the UK needs to get things set by the end of the year, and they've already slipped past the deadline for extension. And two, you actually have had active negotiations between the US and the UK with at least some thought of a trade agreement. Mike, is this just sort of esoterica for trade wonks, or is this going to mean anything?
No, I think it is important. But here's what I would say. For most U.S. business, the outcome of the UK-EU negotiations are far more important than the outcome of the U.S.-UK negotiations. I mean, the United States has something like $1 trillion of investment in the EU 27, and maybe another $700 billion within the UK. A lot of that investment predicated on a smooth trade and investment relationship between the UK and the EU. That now looks to be in danger as they continue to kind of lower their sights on what they can accomplish in that agreement, certainly before December 31st of this year. So for many of the companies that we work with, that's their paramount concern. In terms of U.S.-UK, commercially, that's not terribly exciting, given that the trade investment relationship is already quite open. But hopefully the two sides will at least seize the opportunity to be creative and ambitious and really kind of set a high standards for the EU to follow, for Japan to follow, for others to follow around the world, particularly in areas, related to data flows and transfers, the digital economy in general, financial services, intellectual property rights, rules on state-owned enterprises, because they should be in a position to do that. And so I think those are the issues that we follow most closely as it relates to Europe.
Scott, are we going to hear anything? Thank you. That's very useful. Scott, how are you seeing Europe?
No, I tend to agree with that, but I think that we are, the 800-pound gorilla in the room is agriculture, and I'm really it's a classic example of what should be considered to be relatively insignificant issues, swamping the very important ones on things like digital trade and SOEs and the rest. And we have some experience with the old TTIP. We are seeing already some issues with the UK with respect to chlorinated chicken and the rest. I wouldn't say I'm skeptical, but I think it's a coin toss as to whether a lot of these very sensitive agricultural issues might eliminate the chances for a deal with either the UK or the EU. I mean, I'm hopeful that they can work them out, but I mean, look, we have some experience with this, and it's not very optimistic.
Okay, thank you. Now, we're overdue for a poll, my fault. I wanted to give, Mike, you especially, because I know you had some thoughts on this, but Scott, you're consistently thoughtful on this as well. We talk about this, we look out around the world and we think, what does this mean? We made some brief mention. There's a domestic component of the trade policies. We've talked about Buy America. What do you see happening with industrial policies? I believe the Biden administration explicitly said we're only going to turn to trade agreements once we get sort of domestic things in order. Mike, how did you interpret that?
Yeah, I mean, exactly right. I think they were more explicit on that point in the Democratic Party platform than about anything else in the document. It's basically tend to business on the home front before we even think about negotiating new trade agreements. And so what does that mean? I mean, industrial policy, that used to be kind of a pejorative term. Now it's a song being sung by Democrats and Republicans, meaning different things, to be sure. But what it means on both sides is a much heavier level of government involvement in economic decision making, and with the goal being to either reshore or onshore productive capacity in the United States, to develop new technologies, or to limit import competition in sensitive areas. So I think you could be looking at government subsidies, for example, what has already been proposed for the semiconductor industry in this year's defense authorization bill, subsidies of other sectors, the use, potentially or proposed use of protectionist measures to limit import competition, the use of the tax code to incentivize, again, onshoring of capacity or spending on R&D in areas that have been identified as being strategically important. So again, Democrats and Republicans will emphasize different policies within this mix, but the general thrust is to have the government much more active in shaping commercial and economic outcomes in areas that are deemed strategically important.
So, Scott, you and your colleagues at Cato have to be very excited about all this. Is this inevitable?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that last part, Phil?
Is this inevitable? Is this where we're heading?
I don't think it is inevitable if Trump loses. I think right now, first of all, I'll say on the policy side, I'm actually writing a new paper on manufacturing and national security right now. And I can tell you quite plainly that there's a significant disconnect between the actual data and where the political momentum is going. And we see that in semiconductors, we see it in medical goods and pharmaceuticals and the rest, where the politicians and the political class are talking about sledgehammers when really what's needed here are some scalpels. Now, leaving that disconnect aside, I totally agree that certainly that's where things that's where both sides appear to be heading. But, look, this is another case of Republicans parroting the Trump line, which is not a traditional Republican line. And I don't know if after November, if assuming the polls hold and Biden wins handily, whether economic nationalism will be so trendy in the Republican Party again, or whether they will become a check on that type of behavior in Congress. I don't think there's a real clear answer there. If you were to simply take policy views at the moment, however, certainly that appears to be where things are heading.
All right. Great. That'll definitely be something to watch. For our patient audience, we have two polls that we're going to do essentially back to back here to get your take on where things are going forward looking. We've already gotten a fair bit from our expert guests, but the first question, and the wording's important here, so between the two presumptive major party presidential nominees, who would be more likely to lower trade barriers over the coming 4-year term? So this is allowing for the possibility that you that somebody maybe raises them initially, but is trying to achieve something in the longer run. So over the coming 4-year term, who is more likely to lower trade barriers? Is it Joe Biden for the Democratic Party or Donald Trump for the Republican Party? And so you can cast your votes on this one, and we're going to let you say something else about the election in just a second. So, all right, I actually am now seeing votes. We got them coming in. Thank you. We made this binary for you. It's been a long webinar. We know you're tired, but it's just one little click, and you can say who's more likely to lower trade barriers. I'll give it another moment or two as you think this through. Going once, going twice. Survey says strongly believe that Joe Biden would be more likely to lower trade barriers. All right. Thank you for that. I can see where that comes out of discussion. But in a way, that was a little different from maybe the question that you were also curious about. So we're going to jump right to another poll with time running short. And we're going to ask, who do you so before we're asking who would do what on trade, now we're going to ask, who do you think will take office as president in January of 2021? Please note the distinction. This is not whom do you like for president, but what is your prediction of how the election will come out? Strange things happen these days, so we've tossed in an other if you want to be different and engage in all kinds of scenarios. We leave that to you. So, but in terms of where, if you had to bet your money, and there's no gambling associated with this webinar, but if you did, would you go for, do you believe that Joe Biden will win or Donald Trump will win the election? All right, we've already got quite a few votes. Thank you for those. I'll give time for just a few more of you to register your opinion, and then we'll show the results. Then we'll probably have time for about one question before we wrap things up. So, all right. Going once, going twice. Survey says. All right, so it's 62% believe that Joe Biden will be the one taking office. We did get at least somebody to nibble at other, but then just over a third believe that President Trump will win a second term. Does this surprise either of you guys, Mike, Scott?
Neither.
No, I think.
Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, no. I was just going to say it would be a big mistake to rule out President Trump winning re-election. I think, if anything, we've learned over the last several months that things can change very quickly. So this seems about right.
Yeah,
right.
I agree. If you look at the odds, I mean, even right now, at the height of what appears to be Biden's polling popularity, websites like 538 still give Trump a decent shot, something like a 20% shot. So it looks like the audience got this pretty close. I would shout out to the other, though. I hope you were thinking about the Libertarian candidate there. However, I'm not hopeful that you were.
Proselytizing. All right. Actually, so I wish we, okay, we'll do one question. Here's an interesting one. And this is, we know who has staffed a Trump administration. Who do you think would be an effective U.S. trade rep for Joe Biden? And Mike, we're going to assume that you are not eligible in this particular conversation, although in real life. But it's yourself. Who would be an effective USTR for Biden?
Yeah, well, this kind of brings up the age-old debate about the most important qualities of a USTR, right? Do you want a politician who's close to the president and has deal-making skills and can kind of read a room, et cetera, and versus someone who has more substantive expertise in trade policy, in trade negotiations, and that kind of thing. And, you can never find everything in just one person. My own personal bias would be in favor of kind of the former model, somebody who is a proven, skilled politician in the best sense of the word, can deal with Congress, has the ear of the president, has that kind of campaign experience, and then staffed by deputies who provide kind of the technical expertise. So if that's the case, I would look at, maybe one of the, a member of Congress, for example, who's got those political connections and some experience on trade policy. It would be kind of what I think they might be looking for, but we shall see.
Yeah. Scott, are you lobbying for anybody in particular, should this come to pass?
Not anyone in particular, but I think that the hope would be a somewhat pro-trade Democrat, in the sense of the guy I just thought of is Xavier Becerra, who is now not in Congress anymore, but of course has a lot of experience. Now, I have no idea if he's interested or in it at all, but he was always, I thought, pretty thoughtful on trade, and would be somebody that I think, I, being kind of a free trader, would welcome. No idea if that's actually going to happen, but I do agree
he probably just killed his candidacy right now.
Well, I did. If the Trump campaign is listening, it's over for him. I'm sorry in advance. No, but I think actually that's right. It's better to have a politician, a schmoozer at the top, than a technician. I think we've seen that really over the last decade plus, and I would assume that would be the case here. But USTR is typically down on the list of priorities in terms of staffing. So, it also depends on who's left and willing at that point.
All right. Well, thank you both very much. We've exhausted our time. Certainly we haven't exhausted interesting things to talk about, but Mike and Scott, thank you both very much for sharing your insights with us. To all of our listeners, an on-demand version of this webinar will be available shortly after our conclusion and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Please remember to save your spot for upcoming webinars. You'll find that on the top right. Thank you for joining us, and please stay safe.